This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country, and we join their calls for justice.
Serious danger.
Bonus! Bonus content for you patrons for supporting the show. Serious Danger, a podcast about Greens politics in Australia. Thanks, you legends.
Is it green politics or Greens politics? We should figure that out.
It says here green politics. What did I just say?
Greens politics, I think.
Oh, fuck.
But it's not an official Greens Party podcast.
That's very confusing. You'd think we would have figured this intro out by now. It's made possible with the help of the Green Institute, thanks to the Green Institute, and produced by Michael the Griffin. This episode is another installment of Paddy Manning's Inside the Greens, the comprehensive and encyclopedic guide. Held
up the book and it shows where you're up to, and it's literally like it's as though you've just sat down. So much to go. But it's good. I thought the last episode was really good. I was recommending it to people.
Great. Also, I will say that this isn't entirely indicative because the back, a big chunk is the index and the references and stuff. So that is decent.
Yeah.
Probably about as much as we've read now is made up of index and notes at the end. Okay. So
right. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we're starting chapter 3, Green Independence. Last chapter, chapter 2, which we split into two parts, was Democrats, Blockaders, and Disarmers. Pop quiz, Emerald Moon. What do you remember? What comes to mind? Have you been revising ahead of this episode?
No, we talked about the Democrats a little. Well, I'm actually cheating because you just mentioned Joe Valentine.
Yep.
Yeah.
She was in there. The Democrats are on the scene. We talked about the Franklin blockade and the disarmers, that is the nuclear disarmament movement, and Joe Valentine being elected, who would later become a Green senator, being elected in WA. Of course, we also she was initially with the NDP, the Nuclear Disarmament Party, that fell apart because of the trots. We talked about the trots. Yes, we're
talking a lot about nuclear power. Yes, of course. Nuclear power, nuclear weapons and treaties and
And we also discussed the fact that the German Greens came up with the 4 pillars of the Greens movement, courtesy of some former Nazis.
Yes, the Greens, the 4 pillars.
There will be 4 pillars. And in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, a whole bunch of disaffected ALP members who were like, God, Labor sucks and these branch meetings suck and they forgot what they're about. They were doing all this before it was cool. And they formed their own little reading group, which eventually became the Greens, which would eventually, be the forebears of the Greens New South Wales, the New South Wales Greens.
Classic being like, be real, be like Labor, and then realizing actually Labor's not like that and they need to make a new party, a new movement.
Yeah. In this chapter, you'll see the beginning of an inkling from the ALP brain geniuses that maybe if they don't do better on like the environment or on other, issues that matter to people, maybe one day there might be some kind of political threat to them down the line. These
dear listener, it would be a long time before that inkling of an idea formed into a thought in any kind of way.
Would the ALP pay attention to that inkling? Narrator, they wouldn't. So this is Green Independence, and I'll sort of lay out where it's going. We're in the second half of the 1980s. Hawke Labor government is in power. We've got Bob Brown and Joe Valentine trying to figure out.
We got big hair, we got shoulder pads, we got dance music.
Montage. Madonna's in the charts. Yes, Bob Brown's elected in Tasmanian State Parliament. Joe Valentine's at the federal level. Bob Brown's trying to fight environmental destruction in Tasmania, eventually enters into serious power under the Labor-Green Accord. We'll find out about that in a moment. And Joe Valentine is being a total hippie. She's getting arrested. She's trying to save the world from nuclear destruction. Have you heard of the Labor-Green Accord in Tasmania before? You've never heard of this?
No.
Well, it's a pretty interesting history, and really it's we probably should talk about it a lot more or be more aware of it when we talk about our Greens history, because it was, obviously we know that there was the Labor-Green government in the ACT at the moment, and we had the Gillard experience, the minority thing, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, in Tasmania at least, there was basically a Labor-Green government. The Greens, quote unquote, the Tasmanian Greens didn't technically exist. There was a group of Green independents led by Bob Brown, but that was basically the vibe. And there are some wild parallels between how that relationship formed and how those negotiations went down, and the Gillard minority experience.
Ah, yes. Okay. All right. I mean, I think, yes, like I guess I have heard vaguely about, Tasmanian power sharing arrangements, but I certainly don't know the history. So have to get educated in, the deeds of my elders.
Respect your elders, young lady.
Yeah.
And yeah, green independence really is the term, because there's actually a little bit of teal echoes as well, because the MPs. I just mean in terms of, they're all independents, but they all seem to be sort of working together and have shared values.
Just like as an aside, them now talking about the Party of Independence. What was that reported? Like they're going to form a Party of Independence? It's like,
oh boy,
we're just not even like. That's a fucking oxymoron. How are they letting them get away with it? Anyway.
It is very strange. Well, you certainly had that going on. I mean, UTG's in the background for Tasmania, but the Greens themselves haven't technically been formed. And of course, there's still no federal party until 1992. But of course, it's still people working together with shared values. And Bob Brown's at the centre of it. And all the people out of Lake Pedder campaign and the Franklin blockade are also sort of very similar faces that, of course, we will see eventually become
just
leaders,
a bunch of friends,
and big
doing
faces.
Politics, not a party.
It's a coincidence. They keep turning up. All right, so we kick off with Bob Brown in Parliament. Here's the opening paragraph to the chapter. Getting into Parliament is one thing. What to do when you get there is another. When Bob Brown entered the Tasmanian Parliament in 1983, he did not go in as a fully formed 21st century Green. He had to learn on the job, and the Tasmanian House of Assembly in the 1980s was an exceedingly hostile place for a gay Green independent. Bob would later joke that the Risdon prison was more hospitable, and that nothing in his later 16 years in the Senate came close to the ferocity of his decade in state parliament.
Wow, okay.
Dun, dun. Little teaser there. And there is some crazy shit coming up, particularly when you're openly gay man in the late 1980s trying to do some gay law reform when it's still a crime to be a gay man in Parliament. Turns out that, some people don't like that. And
they were kind of mean?
Yeah, like death threat mean. Yeah.
Oh, good.
And someone might be shot at some point too, so get ready for that. Pretty exciting.
Teaser, okay.
So, yes, Manning sort of sets that up as the challenge at the start, but also notes the fact of how successful Bob Brown is. Like, he's the only guy who gets elected in 1983 and then will eventually build this team of Green independents around them and build trust in the idea of Green representation in Tasmania, socially, certainly very conservative state, Liberals in power, and yet, through his example and the example of other people and the respect that ordinary people have for people who are prepared to put their bodies on the line to save Tasmania's beautiful environment, you really do build this pretty incredible movement to just normalise the idea of people who care about the environment getting elected to Parliament and winning. And having said that, with all the environmental fights that are going on, Manning's kind of like, people expect that, but it was actually on like economic questions and expanding the Greens' vision that also really helped bring it home and make it clear to people what the Greens were about.
Right, because it's it's the late 80s, like certainly an interesting economic context to be kind of forging your way in politics in Australia. Obviously an era of significant, dysregulation, privatisation.
Yes.
Just the neoliberal era begins.
And a bunch of recessions.
Yes.
And yes, some real economic bad news. And yes, this is also the year of the Accord. You got the whole federal government, going to the Accord process with the unions to try and combat inflation. And yes, the Greens are there to sort of say, maybe there's another way. Manning describes it like this: a solid economic agenda worked backwards, if you like, from a conservation imperative, whether saving Lake Pedder or the Franklin River, which I think is an interesting sort of twist on is it the tree Tory same thing? The thing that some people who might be who wouldn't describe themselves as socialist or what have you, but are brought to a more radical economic agenda, or a more left-wing economic agenda based on their care for the environment. That is, right? Like they see the capitalism or the economic system as something that will just turn everything to profit, will destroy the natural environment for the sake of money, and will then sort of maybe come around to the idea that, A, that's a really bad system, and maybe we should do more things like tax these massive companies so that we can properly fund and maintain things like World Heritage Sites and national parks, etc.
Which is more, I mean, that's a more common story that I actually hear from my experience in the Greens. Like, so many people that it's the kind of the classic catch cry is like you come for the climate and you stay for everything else, and you kind of develop, a class and an economic politics after initially being interested in the environment, and that's why you kind of turn to the Greens. I find that a really common story.
Yeah, really common. And human rights as well. This wave of Tampa Greens we have too, of hey, don't torture those people. That's really bad. Oh, you're the only party that's saying that? That's interesting. What else do you guys believe? Oh, yeah. You're correct on all the other stuff too. What do you know? Bob Brown also focused on some other stuff during his time in Parliament. He was looking at improving Tasmania's machinery of government stuff. So I know this is a little bit dry and boring, but important. Freedom of information legislation. He was at the forefront of that. Whistleblower protections, anti-gerrymandering legislation. An early win was opening up local council elections to public scrutiny. So I assumed before this that local council, you weren't allowed as a member of the public to go see your local council conduct a meeting. And I guess Bob Brown.
Wait, elections or?
I'm sorry, local council meetings. That should be. Sorry, I've written elections here. Local council meetings, basically, to public scrutiny.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's I mean, I'm not even sure that that's necessarily that all council meetings everywhere across the country you can go, because I know that this is something that's been a matter of contention in Byron Shire, where they have a Greens council. Is like the council closing meetings.
All meetings all the time, or just some for sensitive
maybe
stuff?
Maybe not all the time, but I know that it's been an issue.
Yeah. One unknown voter sent a clipping from the Burnie Advocate that reported on Brown's bill to open up local government meetings to public scrutiny. Scrawled in capitals were the words, "I get enthusiastic about Dr. Brown sometimes. Our local council people still prefer a structure that's as secretive as the Masonic Lodge."
Wow.
So, open government, all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's this little factoid there. Apparently the UTG, the United Tasmania Group, had fought for Tasmania to introduce Hansard into its parliament. Okay, apparently Tassie didn't have Hansard until 1979.
Right. They're just like, what stays in the chamber? What happens in the chamber stays in the chamber. No one needs to know.
There must have been another system. They can't be like, oh, we'll remember it.
No, trust us. I'm pretty sure he said I or abstain.
Yeah, abstain or something.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yeah. It's Tasmania. Who cares? What do you think of this? The very first piece of legislation Brown introduced in 1983 was the Parliamentary Salaries and Allowances Amendment Bill to limit a scheduled pay increase for MPs to 3.5%, in line with the rest of the state's public servants, rather than that of parliamentarians on the mainland. The legislation of Premier Robin Gray's government proposed a 21% increase, which Brown said the state cannot afford and which totally fails to show restraint in difficult times. No wonder the MPs hated him. Brown's bill also sought a permanent solution, backing opposition moves to appoint an independent tribunal to determine parliamentary entitlements.
Our populist anti-politics king.
Yeah,
wow.
I don't know about justifying it on the grounds that we can't afford it, although maybe the state was in a lot of financial problem at this time, and the states are different to a federal government. But yes, I don't know how the fuck they thought they'd get away with increasing their pay by 21%.
21%.
Although inflation was very high, probably some union claims were also around a similar kind of level and was also already dismissed as ridiculous. But your politicians, fuck you. No more money for you.
No more.
How much do you think? Do you think the independent pay thing works? Is that actually an appropriate way to figure out how much they should get paid?
Like the remuneration tribunal?
Yeah.
Oh, God, I don't know. I mean, because the tribunal makes decisions, about the whole public service, right? Like there's one, because there is one for politicians. It's not the same one,
right.
But in Queensland, at least I know, like there's a remuneration tribunal that makes decisions about, all the public services pay as well as politicians.
Across the board.
And does it always get it right? I don't know. Probably not, but...
I mean, do they ever deduct money? Do the wages ever go backwards based on terrible performance?
Do any wages ever go backwards?
Yeah.
Like on that kind of scale,
scale.
Where there's a tribunal decision involved?
Should they go backwards if we don't like them?
Well, that's a good question. Do you think the politicians' pay should be cut? Have we spoken about this actually? Like, have we spoken about how much politicians are paid?
No.
Because, Yeah, I mean, there's varying schools of thought. Like, I think it's a fantastic kind of, anti-politics populist solution to be like, cut politicians' pay. But I also am like, that's not the biggest. I know people are like, oh, they get paid so much. And I'm like, yeah, they do. There are a lot of CEOs and like even just there are high-ranking public servants who are paid a lot more than most politicians.
Yeah.
There are certainly high-ranking managers in the corporate world. There are people who earn who don't even get paid based on their quote unquote labor. Like, it is an interesting question.
It's bonkers. Like the head
ideologically.
of the Department of Treasury gets paid more than the Prime Minister, I think, or the Reserve Bank is on governor is on $900K a year,
Oh,
and
yeah.
the Prime Minister's on $500. And
yeah.
I'm just never convinced by this idea that we need, good salaries to attract the best people.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. When people are like, "Oh, but that's what we
cut to Barnaby
we need
Joyce,
to attract
drunk on
talent."
the crowd, talking into his fucking phone.
No, that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. And I think tying. I don't think that there should be such a significant discrepancy between the pay of politicians and the average work, which obviously there is.
Yeah.
That idea of tying politicians' pay to the median wage, I like that.
Yes. Well, I don't know how you could justify politicians' pay going up by 21% while the rest of the public service is only 3.5.
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
So good call there. Well done. He also worked on some socially progressive bills limiting tobacco advertising. The Green Independent's pretty good on Aboriginal land rights. Bob Brown intervened in the case of Kevin McDonald. This is an Aboriginal guy who was convicted of murder. He was being kept in Risdon prison. His family was in Melbourne, and Bob Brown lobbied hard for him to be relocated to Pentridge, I believe, so that he could be closer to his family. After his interventions, the Premier agreed, and that's what happened. Again, just another great example of a cause that very few other politicians would go near, advocating for the rights of a convicted murderer, but they're still a human being with rights, and prisons fucking suck. And the very least you could do to show a level of clemency and mercy in that case. So I think that's cool.
I mean, yes, I'm sure there would be people who would argue now that the Greens shouldn't sink so much time into things like that that are not broadly popular and aren't class focused. But I don't know. Yeah.
Aren't class focused?
Well, yeah. That are individual kind of human rights discourse. That's quite a liberal, the human rights discourse is a very liberal thing. And I think some people would argue that the Greens spend too much time on that stuff and that it puts off a vast majority of, working class people who, not a vast majority, but a lot of working class people who might otherwise be able to get on board with a socialist movement where we're not were the main it's also about how media represents these things, that it's they'll cover Greens want murderer rights and they won't cover Greens want dental into Medicare or,
It could have been very popular, really, for Tasmania to be like, yeah, fuck that murder off to Melbourne. We hate those little hippies up there.
Anyway. Ship him away. I don't know. Yeah.
What about this one? He also campaigned, he introduced a bill to remove landlords' ability to evict tenants due to distress.
What do you mean? What?
I don't know. I was a bit confused by this too, whether they mean the landlord is distressed and therefore has the right to evict the tenant because of all their distress. But I guess that might have been a very broad definition under law.
I'm not feeling
which landlords
safe
are using,
in this moment.
Triggered.
Landlord using therapy speak to justify evicting their tenant. I think it's time for me to care for me right now.
Having this person in my house is too much emotional labor.
Yeah.
What about his mistakes, though? Brown did not always get it right. In 1985, he pushed to allow councils to debate the addition of fluoride to drinking water, a nod to the anti-fluoride campaigners in the north of the state, including Di Hollister, who would soon stand as a Green Independent. Remember the fluoride debate? That was just a real...
Oh, of course I remember. I grew up in an area that doesn't have fluoride because...
Because of that, really?
Yeah.
And how's that going? Do we know the results of that experiment?
I actually don't know. Well, I don't know that if there are if there's any evidence that people in Byron Shire have not very good teeth, but that's probably a class question. like I think there are other factors, but it's like there's no evidence, as I understand it, that fluoride is actually dangerous in your drinking water. And there is evidence that it can help improve the health of your teeth. It's interesting to me that Bob Brown went for this as a doctor, a medical doctor.
Yeah, I guess maybe the principle of allowing councils to debate that potentially, so to appease certain, maybe he himself was pro fluoride, but in order to,
but was like, we should be able to talk about it.
I guess so. Just asking questions, do your own research.
Just asking questions, yeah.
During the 1989 election, when asked about cannabis, Brown replied, as a doctor, that the medical costs of alcohol and tobacco were already too high without legalizing another drug. A few years later, he was humble enough to admit he had changed his mind. Tasmania would be better off socially and economically by decriminalising the personal use of cannabis.
Oh, wait, hang on. He said, tell me, what did he say about taxes?
During the 1989 election, he said the cost of alcohol and tobacco is too bad already, so he shouldn't legalise another drug. Then a few years later, he
cost,
admits,
you mean like social cost?
The social cost, yes.
Right. Sorry, I meant
not the
you meant financial, like how much it costs to buy, which is expensive in Australia. I see.
The social cost is too bad, and then a couple of years later, he's like, "No, I was wrong there. Fair enough. Everyone would be better off." I mean, he's making that turn in the early 90s, for fuck's sake. And again, very depressing. 30 years later, still having the same bullshit arguments. Yeah. And once again, I'm very grateful the Greens exist to take a sensible line when it comes to drug policy. Good on you, Bobby. And I guess, as a doctor, he probably would have had a bit more credibility.
I mean, yeah, most doctors support like a harm reduction approach to drugs because they've actually, because they've dealt with people
because they know that prohibition is not working. Yes,
and they see the impacts of criminalization and stigmatization. So,
maybe people would be like, "Yeah, but he's a gay doctor. What the hell would this guy know?" Other fights on euthanasia legislation and gun control as well. Again, way ahead of the game. Again, I'm very glad this party and these people exist because they're there back in the day. Never get the credit, of course, for being correct about these certain social issues way ahead of time.
John Howard.
Well, no, I mean, the gun control stuff is in the early 90s, I think, 1987 even, sorry. He first introduced a dangerous weapons bill to register firearms and ban rapid-fire semi-automatic and military-style weapons in Tasmania in 1987 after a spate of armed robberies. And he was also calling out Tasmania as the only state not taking part in a working group framing national gun control laws. Now, I don't know enough about this, and I don't want to use hyperbole, but, the stuff he's talking about there, in theory, you could argue, if you had something like that passed in the early 90s, maybe Port Arthur doesn't actually fucking happen, And of course, and as Paddy Manning says, the bill was opposed, all this stuff was opposed by both major parties. Vindication in the worst way possible would take another 5 years, right? I mean, it's, the sensible course regulation are dismissed as a ridiculous hippie, then a horrible tragedy strikes, and then, suddenly that's the only way that people are called to action.
Well, do you subscribe to the view, I mean, it's kind of like an accelerationist view, right? That we as a country needed to experience like rock bottom. We needed to experience a tragedy like Port Arthur to then have everyone on board. That if we hadn't had something like that, we won gun control, it would then be much easier to unwind because we don't have that collective memory.
I guess so. I guess I would like to believe in a better society in which we can make good changes to prevent things that we know will happen. I mean, you also don't need the tragedy to happen in your own country. There's a wealth of evidence of just how bad that shit can be, and you would hope that we would be able to look at other examples and say, that's terrible. We don't want that to happen here. Let's regulate things sensibly. And also, and the reverse of that too. Hey, look at this other country. They have a way better healthcare system. They have a better education system. They have more things under state control, collective ownership. That seems to be working well. Let's do that here, please. What do you think about that?
The gun, I truly don't know. Like, I do think that, well, but then again, you look at America and it's not as though every school shooting brings them any closer to a collective consensus around gun control, is it? So it's probably nonsense.
Yes.
Probably didn't need
Yes.
father.
Yes, if you want an example of a country where there's heaps of massacres and no action.
Yeah.
Ding,
Yeah.
ding, ding. Oh, God. All right, gay law reform. This is a big one, and I'll share a little bit of this with you. Lastly, Brown took a softly approach to gay law reform, particularly the decriminalisation of homosexuality. He waited years for the right opportunity, which came in 1987. Tasmania's Law Reform Commission had recommended repeal of the 2 sections that made it a crime, punishable with 21 years in jail for 2 males to have sex in private. That's in 1987.
In private?
Yeah.
Why? Oh, but they're saying, but keep the offence for having sex in public, I guess. Okay. So, it's just a weird thing to say specifically in private. I don't.
Well, I guess underlining the ridiculousness of the law, but it's illegal for anyone to have sex in public.
Surely.
Yes. And you know why? Because of homophobia, right?
That's right. And that's what we need to work on.
Is that going to be the new Greens policy?
That's the new, that's right.
I should be able to suck a man
Our
off
balance of
out on the
power
street.
demand sex in public.
Have you ever had sex in public?
What's public?
Outside of a dwelling.
Yeah. Have you?
When there were people around?
No.
Okay.
Well, not within view of anyone.
Sure.
What about you?
Moving on. The Grey government rejected any such legalisation of homosexuality. Brown moved to repeal both sections of the code and read out a Launceston Examiner op-ed that backed the decriminalisation. There is a belief among some, particularly among parliamentarians adept at transforming ignorance and prejudice into moral righteousness and votes, that governments have a right to be in the bedrooms of the community. They haven't. So, good part of that op-ed, but Brown also read out a section that threw a sop to the homophobes. Homosexual acts do not have to be accepted or condoned by society. Repugnance to such behaviours needs no apology.
It's so. I hate it when he does this.
It is sad that he has to read this out.
I understand, but yeah.
Then he framed the debate in terms of the lives directly affected. In a world beset with great crises, this amendment may not be all important, but it is important to many individuals in the Tasmanian community. Both parties voted against Brown's amendment. Attorney General John Bennett insisted that the criminal law has a role to play in condemning conduct which most people in this state continue to find offensive and morally reprehensible.
Wow. Not that long ago. Really not that long ago.
Real soon. And so depressing that in 1987, the Law Reform Commission says repeal these things, and of course it doesn't actually get decriminalised for another decade, I believe, into the late 90s.
Classic, yeah.
South Australia decriminalised homosexuality in 1976, and so, yes, the movement across the country is certainly building, but Tasmania was the last holdout. They were not exactly, they were not fans, they were hanging on to that for dear life.
Were they the last holdout? I thought it took Queensland a while too, right?
No, Tassie was the last one.
Oh, okay, maybe I'm thinking of something specific like gay panic.
Gay panic defense, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you guys really held on to that one as long as you could too. Again, pretty amazing. Bob Brown's an openly gay MP and copying all this. There's the Salamanca arrests in 1988. That was a big catalyst for the movement. That was just people at the Salamanca markets trying to sign up people to a petition saying, hey, being gay should be a crime. The cops arrest a bunch of people of that. That gets a lot of media attention. Rodney Croom's there talking about that. The AIDS crisis is obviously playing a big factor too. Anti-gay groups in Tasmania formed within weeks with, okay, so check out these acronyms. For a Caring Tasmania, FACT, right, that was a group, and Concerned Residents Against Moral Pollution, CRAMP. Staging rallies that were often fronted by government MPs.
Moral pollution, fucking hell.
FACT and CRAMP. So then there's also some interesting tensions between the activist base, queer rights activists in Tasmania who obviously want to make a lot of noise, get a lot of attention, and the more sort of softly approach of someone like Bob Brown or other people who are in Parliament who are a little bit like, come on, guys, let's, think about this strategically. Let's not make a lot of noise. And other people going, nah, we need to be out, proud,
Let's still
visible.
Acknowledge that we're all disgusting, perverts and shouldn't exist, but don't send us to jail.
Oh, God. In short, Brown and his colleagues had to be pushed. Christine Milne records that the 1990 Legislative Council debate on decriminalisation of homosexuality was appalling, with calls to run homosexuals out of Tasmania, to reintroduce the death penalty for them, and at the very least, to jail them. Brown got plenty of hate mail for his trouble. A thick file of unfriendly letters in Brown's archives ranges from abusive, and then some quotes here and trigger warning. We've got some, very homophobic, queerphobic slurs here. Down with dung pushers, or you're a poofter, Brownie, a real asshole. I tell you true, Brownie, I would sooner fuck a camel than fuck around with you.
Nobody asked you to fuck. He's like,
there's not an option. There's no two options. That's also a crime, by the way, fucking a camel. Too threatening, like one with a spoof no dams triangle logo for the Society for the Extermination of Greenies and Poofters. Another was stuck under the front door of the the Wilderness Society office in Launceston. I have my wife and kids to care for. You are trying every day to put me out of a job. I know where Bob Brown lives, and he knows that I know. I might surprise him with my chainsaw in the very near future.
Whoa.
I assume that's also to do with the environmental.
That's got to be I don't understand.
I don't know how putting him out of a job,
how that relates to, but yeah.
As a gay would work, but there you go. Anyway, pretty intense.
Fucking hell.
1986 election, state comes around. Bob Brown is easily re-elected, and Dr. Jerry Bates, another Green independent, joins him in Parliament. So he's on board.
Doctors abound.
Doctors.
Yeah.
Do you have any other doctors now? No. Was Di Natale the last one, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah. Can't think of any. We're forgetting someone?
Old mate. I mean, the Teal from...
they're not a Green.
Yes.
Well, there's Monique Ryan.
Sorry.
Anyway.
Dr. Monique Ryan. And there was a big swing to the Liberals at that election. And that is when Labor's sort of starting to take notice, I suppose. All right. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, shit, these Greens are doing okay. They're getting a bit of media attention. Labor isn't getting any traction. The schism between, say, the union movement and workers potentially in the clash with environmental concerns is starting to make a few people take notice.
Noidus.
Senator Graham Richardson, Richo, who's in the Hawke cabinet and is urging the federal Labor government to do more on the environment. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that Richardson believes that in the long term, it is also important that the ALP doesn't allow discontent to grow to the point where the now ad hoc fielding of independent Green parties is replaced by a more organised Green party as a force in Australian politics.
God forbid. That would be really scary. Oh, we might lose some seats. Took us, 30 fucking years?
Yeah. It's hard. It's a hard job to do.
It's hard.
Gray Richardson sucks for a whole bunch of different reasons, but you would have to admit that he's a canny political operator and is seeing these possible tensions.
Most canny political operators suck, don't they?
Yes, that's true. Yes, you can't be both. You can't be one without the other, I guess. Yeah. So we move into the next section of the chapter. There are more environmental fights, and the wood chip industry is kicking off. There are more dams being built. It's all pretty bad news. You got a Liberal government in there. They hate the Greenies. They, even though the Franklin blockade defeated them along and is very present in everyone's memory, they're still saying, let's cut shit down. The equivalent of drill, baby, drill, whatever that is for the wood chip industry. I guess cut. The Wilderness Society start organising tree sits and blockades to protect natural habitat, including one at Farmhouse Creek at the bottom of the Picton Valley, where there was lots of logging was starting to kick off. It was the beginning of the Wilderness Society's first major blockade since the Franklin. In what would become famous as the Battle of Farmhouse Creek, the logging company sent busloads of vigilante workers in to smash the blockade, and things soon got dangerously violent. The police, under orders from the gay government... Damn it. The police, under orders from the Grey government...
to be clear.
We're going to leave that in. Okay, yeah. The Grey government. One day, friends. One day, if the Greens get to power, it'll be the Grey government. The police, under orders from the Grey government not to intervene, watched on as protesters were bashed and chainsaws wielded against them. One worker halfway cut Ma's tree. So this is Alec Ma, a former bricklayer who joined the Wilderness Society. Great example of, workers uniting with people concerned about the environment. So he's sitting in the tree. They half cut the tree. It was swaying wildly in the wind with him in it. Senator Norm Sanders from the Democrats was one of the 37 people arrested, as was a young Nick McKim, later a Greens MP.
Oh, wow.
There he was. I love it when the little figures we know sort of start popping up in the history.
Cute.
It's quite. I know I'm very naive here at like way ahead of the game, but like reading this, and we've seen it a couple of times already in the book, the role that the police plays in these blockades and demonstrations. Again, I never computed that. It took me a long time to come to the sort of left-wing analysis that police
not only didn't intervene, but in a lot of cases were beating up the protesters actively. Right. Certainly that, I suppose Queensland in particular, but in a lot of the history that you read about in Queensland, like people can go back and listen to I think we spoke briefly about the Daintree blockade at one point. But yeah, certainly up in North Queensland, the cops were absolutely just like throwing hands at the protesters, just beating the shit out of them. That was expected.
Now, how do you think about that in terms of, okay, there's a whole lot of propaganda, we know that, right? But I also believe that there are lots of people who would buy the lie that they want to join the police to serve their community. They have family members who are police. They're told that cops are heroes, and I think you can reasonably imagine someone saying, "I want to join the police to stop the bad guys, to help ordinary people, to keep society safe and make it a better place." I doubt many people join the police specifically because they want to bash hippies at environmental protests. Yeah, but of course that's where they end up, because when you're in the police, you got to do what you got to do, right?
Yes, and I certainly think as well there was a culture, like I very much doubt there were many, if any, women there. Not to buy into we just need more women and then people will be nicer. But like certainly like a boys will be boys culture, like a very blokey culture, and a culture of like, I think you join to whatever, protect and serve, and in their mind, they are being prevented from doing their job by these hippies, and they just get to a point where they're just annoyed. And the thing that you do when you're a man and you just get fucking pissed off is you let off steam and you beat the shit out of whoever is pissing you off, whether it's some protesters or your wife and kids. And that's why I think that it's just it's not necessarily that the bashings are part of that kind of honourable thing that they join for, but it's just that, well, that's what you do when someone stops you from doing your job. That as though that's not actually your job, like violent repression of protest, when that's how it ends up most of the time.
And you're brainwashed to view these people as criminals, right? And they're not ordinary people. You have no obligation to them. Like
they have no
even though they're
legitimate
citizens, cause.
They're just troublemakers. Right. Like they're just they just don't want to. They don't have jobs. They, I don't know.
They should be shot at, e.g. Bob Brown. Newly elected Bob Brown put his body on the line, lying down in front of the bulldozers. He was forcibly dragged away by the workers, who laid into him, breaking his glasses, ripping his shirt, punching and kicking him in the groin, as police did nothing. It was all captured by the cameras, and a photographer snapped one of the most iconic images of Brown's career as he was manhandled by half a dozen workers in hard hats. I'm sure lots of people listening to this would have seen that image. We saw it in the documentary a lot.
I have.
It's sort of a classic, It made news bulletins and front pages around the country. 2 days later, Brown was shot at as he walked above the creek with two companions. And this is Bob Brown talking about that experience. It was getting dark when a van of pro-logging vigilantes cruised past. One of the men in the van yelled out, "Are yous Bob Brown?" I did not reply, and we kept walking. They drove downhill about 50 metres before stopping. A man got out, walked around to the back of the van, opened it up, and took out a gun. He fired 2 shots in our direction. After he reported this shooting to the police, the men were arrested and subsequently fined a couple of $100 for shooting on a Sunday.
Wait. That's what they were fined for?
I think that's Bob Brown's little jokey commentary there on it.
Oh, really?
Yes, a couple $100, I guess, for potentially, or perhaps that was the offence that he was.
Maybe you weren't allowed to shoot on Sunday.
Allowed to shoot it. Well, that's Lord's Day. Shoot Monday to Saturday.
Yeah, Monday. That's the day of rest. No shooting. Shoot the hippies on your Saturdays, folks.
If it had been environmentalists who'd had the guns, there would have been lengthy jail terms. Of course.
Yeah.
The police are not neutral in such things. They are on the side of the fucking state and the fascists,
What insane.
Anyway, what's interesting, I guess, is that Graham Richardson travels to Tasmania. I believe he has the environmental portfolio at this point. And if people have seen the documentary Labour in Power, which ABC did a while ago, it sort of looks into this interesting period in which Graham Richardson, right-winger, power broker, whatever it takes, motherfucker, happened to become very invested in environmental stuff. I guess he recognized the threat of the Greens environmentalists, but he also seemed to develop a personal affinity with trying to protect the natural environment, but also recognized that, the Hawke government could do more and could win votes by getting out there and fighting for the environment, apparently. So anyway, he becomes quite friendly with Bob Brown. He encourages Bob Hawke to come down and to Tasmania to check it all out. And in the 1987 election, the Wilderness Society and Green Independents basically urge people to vote for Labor in 11 marginal federal seats, helping to swing the poll for the government, which is kind of interesting, I suppose. Then a pulp mill comes onto the scene. A proposed pulp mill in what?
I don't know. A pulp mill. Enter a pulp mill.
This is in Wesley Vale. Lots of people worried about a pulp mill when people might be more familiar with the Guns saga from about a decade ago. But back in the late 80s, it was the Wesley Vale pulp mill that people were very worried about. A former school teacher and the mother of 2 young kids, Christine Milne, born and bred on a dairy farm at Wesley Vale.
Heard of her?
Ever heard of her? We've met her already. She was at the Franklin blockade getting arrested, but now she's back, baby. And she set up Concerned Residents Opposed to Pulp Mill Siting, otherwise known as CROPS.
Wow, it was all about the acronym back in those days, hey?
Why did they need all these acronyms?
I guess because it was maybe genuinely because, you relied more on printed material, right? And, a good acronym is helpful to chuck something on a sign or a pamphlet, whatever.
But they're just trying so hard. They clearly started with CROPS.
It's I know, and they're like,
Then work backwards. And she proves herself to be very useful. Milne proved a formidable spokesperson for CROPS, adept at forming alliances with abalone divers, doctors, farmers, trade unionists, scientists, and conservationists, domestically and worldwide. She worked closely with Brown and Bates, who raised the pulp mill in Parliament. CROPS took chances, organising what Milne calls the first farmers' rally in Australia, where they drove their tractors into Devonport, letting off rotten egg gas at a public meeting.
What?
So everyone could smell the hydrogen sulfide, the same odour the pulp mill would emit.
Clever. Love.
Very clever. Again, Richo sees the political opportunity in courting the farmers' votes. He said all these farmers that are pissed off, they might be former Liberal voters who would swing to Labor, might help us at the next 1990 election, and basically encourages them to introduce the most stringent environmental protection standards on the pulp mill, which basically makes it unviable, and the project is shelved.
Yeah. And yet we have a myth that the Greens are anti-farmer.
Yes.
Anyway.
We're good, actually, and we can connect with heaps of people. This causes Liberal Premier Robin Gray to call a snap election in 1989 to try and get the pulp mill back on track, okay? That turns out to be a pretty bad move for him because people are not a fan. It is a watershed election for the Green Independents. There is a 12% swing to them, reaching a total of 17% vote across the state, which is pretty wild. They win 5 lower house seats. Christine Milne gets elected. A Uniting Church minister named Reverend Lance Armstrong. He gets elected. He'd later write a book about his time in Tasmanian Parliament entitled, Good God, He's Green.
Oh, my God.
So they all get in there. The Liberals lose the majority by 1 seat, and the Green Independents are in the balance of power.
Ooh la la.
Well. And so the Liberals try and negotiate with the Green Independents for a minority government, okay? They try and put up this illusion, just like Tony Abbott calling Adam Bandt in 2010, saying, I've always been considered myself an environmentalist. Robin Gray sits down with the likes of Bob Brown and Christine Milne and says, hey, let's try and work something out. It does not go very well because they despise them and hate the Greenies. That's sort of the entire political identity, is hating these fucking hippies. And basically the negotiations collapse. The Liberals, check this out. The Liberals would shortly be implicated in an extraordinary but unsuccessful attempt to bribe Labor's Jim Cox to cross the floor and give the Conservatives an outright majority.
Wow.
Cox revealed he'd been offered $110,000 by businessman and newspaper publisher Ed Rouse. After a royal commission, Rouse was prosecuted and jailed.
Damn.
Tasmania
Wow.
rules. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. That's fucking awesome.
Huge.
So Liberals say no good. And then, of course, Brown and Independents start negotiating with Labor leader Michael Field. And they basically land on what would eventually become known as the Labor-Green Accord.
Yes.
Even though that, the Green Independents still not the Greens, but this is basically the power sharing agreement that the Independents would put together to guarantee the Labor government.
I'm sure
take
that
power.
it would be called something like Labor Teal Accord now if that's
Sure.
what had worked out. Yeah.
Classic. Bob Brown decides not to pursue a cabinet position in the new government because he knows it's going to be a very tough job. I mean, the Liberals apparently tried everything they could to hang on to power. Obviously, they tried to bribe a Labor MP to walk across, but tried all these parliamentary tactics to try and remain a minority government. And Bob Brown knew that the next couple of years was going to be intense. The Liberals were going to hate them. And so he said, I'm not going to worry about trying to be in cabinet and deal with all that at the same time while it's coming our way.
Fair.
The question was about how hard they were going to push during these negotiations, what they could get for. There were 2 weeks of negotiations. Forestry, in particular, was the massive sticking point. Eventually, they got a bit of stuff. The Green Independents pushed as far as they could. So far, in fact, they had to pull back. But they succeeded in getting many better government provisions in, such as commitments to fixed 4-year terms, a pecuniary interests register, and disclosure of donations. And the very last item tacked on, the abolition of subsidised liquor for government ministers.
Oh my God. I'm sorry. That is so cringe. Imagine being in balance of power and those are the things that you get. That sucks. Sorry. That sucks.
Well, but can we agree that it sucks that government ministers were getting subsidised liquor?
Sure.
That sucks. Okay.
But
Well, I mean, I don't know. Are we in a position to judge at this point? This is the first time they're doing it.
It just reminds me, this is when people are like, oh, if the Greens end up in balance of power in Queensland, you have to push for an upper house. And it's like, that's not, no. Like, oh, you have to push, you should demand compulsory preferential voting in local government elections as your balance of power demand. Like,
well, okay, let me clarify. That's not all they got in these negotiations, and particularly on the environment. Sorry. These were perhaps the last things in the deal that were also sort of speaking to their
they were little
open,
throw-in
transparent
things.
government. Yes.
Yeah.
They also got on forestry. No pulp mill. They doubled the World Heritage Area in Tasmania. They got a new national park.
Love.
And they got this ceiling of 2.8 million tonnes on the annual wood chip exports from Tasmania. Okay, so that was better. And that was based on...
I still want a little more social democracy, but, it's the Green.
There you go.
We understand.
It was that last condition, the ceiling on annual wood chip exports, that would prove too much for the union movement and the forestry industry and would later lead to the undoing of the accord. Also, Liberal leader Robin Gray cried foul and, in another precedent for the Gillard years, was relentless in undermining the legitimacy of the Labor-Green government, moving no confidence motions at every opportunity. Classic. I wonder if Tony studied all this when he was going into opposition.
Surely.
The attacks were blatantly sexist too. Milne and Di Hollister were called political sluts for getting into bed with Labor.
By who?
I don't know. These cunts, I guess.
Right.
Conservatives.
It was like the classic, the cartoon. What's the cartoon? Gillard and Bob Brown. Is that it?
Oh, yeah. Well, and she was Bob Brown's bitch or whatever.
Bob Brown's bitch. Yeah.
Kind of
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. I thought, something about them being in bed together.
So they get a bunch of stuff. I prepare to give them a bit of leeway in that, yes, they're not even technically a party yet. This is their first time doing this. Yeah. And this is the first time this has been done. As far as I can tell, in Australian history, this is the first time there was any kind of Labor-Green alliance anywhere. But, it sounds like, at least particularly on that World Heritage Area or national parks and stuff, I think it'd be amazing to think that you were responsible for establishing a national park.
That is pretty incredible. Yeah.
Pretty wild.
That's pretty cool.
But the honeymoon does not last very long. They get into government, they look at their state finances. Turn out it is no good. Tasmania is in shitloads of debt. And of course, interest rates are skyrocketing, so the cost of borrowing is very high. And all these major resources are being sold off. Like stuff is either being privatized or, of course, the shitty amount of royalties on the resources that are being exported out of the state. Classic. Incoming Premier Michael Field had to cut hard, including closing down dozens of small country schools. The Independents, particularly Milne and Hollister, who are both teachers, had promised a lot of extra funding for public education. Suddenly
do we buy that they had to I mean, you look at I think Labor uses a similar line that they've been lumped with this debt or poor economic management.
Right.
We're lumped with this debt, and so we have to do this. Meanwhile, tax
Yes.
cuts, submarines, etc. So I think that there's always something you can cut before schools.
Certainly. Well, yes. I would say the only disclaimer on that is that, yes, state governments are in a different position in terms of raising their own revenue and these kind of things.
Yeah, there are ways to raise revenue.
There are ways to raise revenue in the state, but not exactly the same as government, and they also don't have the same borrowing power. So there's that consideration.
Mhm.
But you're right; these are all political choices, political choices about the things that they do allow to carry on. And exactly the same thing played out in Victoria under Jeff Kennett, under a Liberal premier, and of course we all despise him. But when a Labor government does it, then yes, of course, Labor apologists will say, "Well, difficult decisions, yada yada yada." But you're right; Manning phrases it as he had to cut hard, which is perhaps a bit of ideology at play. Suddenly we found, after the event, there was no money for new schools, but there wasn't even enough to maintain what they had, Milne recalls. At the beginning, says Milne, a Labor government with Greens holding the balance of power seemed the most exciting thing in Australian politics, and people were moving back to Tasmania from all over the country.
I don't know about that, Christine.
Hey, we went there. I don't know. Then suddenly cuts, everywhere cuts, and cuts to the people we had made promises to. So that undermined the relationship between Labor and the Greens because we were all under such enormous stress. Good news, though, and some fucking vindication for Milne here. She fights for it. She introduces a private member's bill to try and save these schools. And I think this is a really interesting insight into the negotiation process. Brown left the negotiations to Christine as the group's education spokesperson, and Milne proved she was no pushover. Of course, this is the advantage of not having been in politics. I really didn't have a sense of what an enormous thing was going to negotiations, that is. So around the Premier's advisors come in their dark suits to say, this is it. If you do this, Michael Field is off to Government House. We're not going to allow you to move this motion of no confidence and get the Liberal support and bring the Deputy Premier down like this. We're off to Government House. Sorry, bit of background. Christine Milne was proposing a motion of no confidence in the Deputy Premier, who was also the Education Minister, basically saying, he's shutting down all these schools. I have no confidence in this minister. So basically they're threatening her, saying, right, that's it. We're going to we'll go to Government House. We're going to have an election if you do this. And Christine says, I said, good, see you. Okay, fine, off you go then. So out they go, and we're all standing there thinking, well, here we go. I wonder what's going to happen next. About 10 minutes later, the white car leaves for Government House with Peter Patmore in the back to resign as Education Minister, and my private member's bill got up to save the schools, and all those schools were saved.
Whoa. Power.
Power and sticking to your guns and a recognition of the fact that unless the circumstances are extraordinary, no Labor government is going to go to another election before they want to.
Yes.
Okay?
It's true.
Nor should they.
Remember.
Out of anger or, spite for the Greens. So fucking stare them down. So good on you, Christine. Your naivety in that particular circumstance really came through, and I think that's fucking great. Again, tough economic conditions. A recession is looming. There's a rethink of the sort of political economic policies. There's a lot of discussion about what should the economic future of Tasmania should be. The Greens, of course, are saying that, hey, Tasmania shouldn't just be cutting down our beautiful forests. We should try and have a long-term plan to work on sustainability, on tourism. We want this state to be the place that people come to look at beautiful natural environment. Very good idea that has basically become, been validated over years. 30 years later, most people adopt that idea and recognize that vision that the Greens had for the state of Tasmania down the track. Eventually, though, there is a lot of instability during the Labor-Green Accord year. Of course, this might all be very familiar with people who lived through the Gillard years. In 1990, they decided to return to the United Tasmania Group for some reason. They wanted to rebrand and go back to UTG. That turned out to be a terrible idea. Most people knew about the Greens now. They associated with the Greens, even if there was an official party. So that was sort of a weird choice. And then basically by the end of this particular government, there was a general vibe that the promise of the Accord hadn't been fulfilled and people had been let down.
Do you think, were they just being well, we're more than just the Greens? That classic, when people are like, the Greens should change their name because they're not just about environmental issues.
I guess so. What does it say here? The independents, with no party organisation, decided to revive the name of the United Tasmania Group. That was a big mistake that contributed to a sense of fragmentation among Green parties nationally. Just a lot of confusion, it seemed.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, and a lack of coordination, and I guess a lack of willingness to sort of sort out, hey, and this also, the failure of that decision also spurs people to say, hey, should we become an organised party? Should we become a federal party?
Yeah.
And those conversations are also kicking around across the country.
They're like, what are we? We haven't really had the talk. And I don't know, should we like put a label on this? Like,
what the hell? Eventually, there's this big forestry backlash, right? So there's tension between the union movement when it comes to these wood chip ceiling and the Greens. The part of the deal, the Labor Greens Accord, which is to put a ceiling on that comes to the fore. Hawke's under leadership pressure. He gets rid of Richo in the environmental portfolio, moves things around, and of course, eventually Paul Keating takes over. Our wonderful hero, Paul Keating, check out this quote. When he took over as Prime Minister, Paul Keating was reported to have told a staff Christmas party that one of his achievements in his first year of office was putting the environment back where it belonged.
Where?
I guess being less influential and powerful?
Just off the agenda.
Yeah. What an asshole!
Oh, but he had singers, Tom. He had singers.
He loved the what did he say? Do you slowly?
Oh, I'm gonna do you slowly. Oh, we're Banana Republic.
Now the focus, of course, is on resource security. This is the term, which is basically like, let's just cut down as many trees as we can, make as much money as possible to secure the economic future of Tasmania. Fuck the environment. That's the new vibe. And Bob Brown goes to Michael Field, the Premier, and says, are you going to honour this wood chip limit? He says, no, we're not. And so what do you know? The Labor Green
What was the
Accord
point of the fucking deal then? Deal's a deal.
You know? Politicians lie and they do backflips. I don't know whether they wrote anything down or had any kind of...
Yeah.
But I mean, by the time you get to the point where it's almost an election, I guess you'd say, well, we're going to go to an election anyway. So what are you going to do? Have no confidence in me.
Wow.
So there is an election in January of 1992. There is a massive swing to the Liberals at that point. All the Green independents are returned. Surprise, surprise.
Still?
But Labor gets kicked out. And Labor Premier Michael Field is very bitter about that. Premier Field swore Labor would never again enter into an accord with the Greens. According to Milne, it was an absolutely stupid position for the government to take because theoretically they would never be in government again, which is why it was the Labor Party that drove the process to cut the numbers in the Tasmanian Parliament. Field would never lose the bitterness, telling the ABC a decade later there was a fundamental problem with the way the Greens did politics. It seemed to me as Premier daily, but it was probably monthly, there was a threat to bring the government down. So it wasn't actually conducive for harmonious relationships.
Oh, they don't negotiate. They don't know how to negotiate. They make good the enemy of the bad. Oops, yes. I mean, perfect.
Well, I'm sorry, mate, but like bringing down the government is the only power that the Greens would have in that position. And if you were going to betray the things that you agreed on, which is exactly what you did,
the whole point is like, yes, we get this or we bring down the government. The government does what we want or we bring it down.
Yes. And if you agree to do that at the start of your taking power and then it looks like you're not going to do that, guess what the Greens are going to do, my friend?
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I'm sure in Labor law, because it was only a one-term Labor government, this was viewed as a disaster.
Yeah. Big mistake. Never do that again.
Big mistake. Never do it again. We lose votes. People hate us if we seem to be working with the Greens. Once again, I point to the
Always
ACT,
taking
the
the wrong
long-term
lessons.
success. Yes.
Yeah.
There you have it. That is the first half of chapter 3. The next part of the chapter, honestly, I think you're going to love it. It's great stories about Joe Valentine being a senator and fucking shit up in Parliament and letting her hair out in a very literally as a hippie.
She's burning bras.
But also doing good. I don't know if she's burning. She's got crystals. I'll tease that. She's got crystals.
She's casting spells on the Liberals. Okay.
It's kind of awesome, though. I'm quite a big fan of it.
Okay. All right. Oh, thanks, Tom.
No worries, Emerald. Any questions? Any thoughts, feelings? I
don't want there to be a quiz, but there's so much history. There's so many things that happened. I guess the thing, and there's just no podcaster. They didn't have podcasts at the time, Tom, to pick apart week to week what was happening in fucking Parliament. Yeah.
Thank God we exist. Thank you. Thank God that you exist,
Thank God
patrons,
you
for supporting the
exist.
show. We
Dear
really
listener.
appreciate it. Make sure you enjoy the whole back catalogue. If you've joined late, you haven't listened to all the old episodes. There's some cracking stuff in there. Will Anderson, John Kadelka doing Rusted on Bingo. Wonderful content for you to enjoy. You can always send us an email or message us through Patreon anytime.
Yeah.
hello@seriousdangerpod.com. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
And we will catch you again.
Yeah. Send us your ideas for stuff that you want us to cover on the Patreon as well.
Please.
More stuff like this, less stuff like this, people, things, whatever it is.
We've still got 30 more chapters to go.
Yes, we do. We do.
Serious Danger Australia.